Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Greetings of peace, love, and light. I pray everybody's well. You're tuned into Path and Present podcast, and I am your host, Baraka Blue, broadcasting from a rainy and gray November day in Seattle, Washington. Alhamdulillah. Sending love and light to you and yours. A few updates before this podcast. This Saturday, November 23rd, I will be in Portland, Oregon. I'll be doing a program with a new organization called Kimia. Kimia means chemistry or alchemy, right? Alchemia is how we get those words. And it's a good organization, beautiful organization that is brand new. And it's kind of like a sister organization, inshallah, to Wasat, our organization here in Seattle. And I'll be talking about Islam and the cultural imperative, Dr. Omar Farouk Abdullah's paper. So come through if you're in the Pacific Northwest, and you can find information on my social media. Other than that, I'll be coming to Boston in December, Boston and the LA area in December. You can find information about that on my social media as it comes up. And if you're in Seattle, come on through to Wasat. We've been doing a lot of programs. And we just had a great week with Dr. Bilal Ware here in town. And a series of programs capped off by our annual Mawlid celebration of the birth of the beloved Prophet, sallallahu alaihi wasallam, where we also had nasheed artist Uthman Ames and percussionist Marlon Alton, friends of mine from the Bay Area. And it was a wonderful turnout, and it was a great group of people coming together for the reason of love and salutations upon the best of creation, sallallahu alaihi wasallam. This episode is with Dr. Bilal Ware. We recorded it while he was in town. And for those that don't know, Dr. Bilal is a specialist in Islam in Africa. And he has written a couple books, and he's working on a couple more that he told me about. His first book is called The Walking Quran, and it's about traditional Islamic pedagogy in West Africa. And it's a great book. And then his follow-up book is called Jihad of the Pen, and it is about great poets, great writers, and great authors of West Africa. So check both of those out and be on the lookout for his other work as well. In this conversation, we talk on themes of that, what sent him on his journey to dive into this topic, and I hope you enjoy it. I want to say thank you to everybody who supports the podcast, everyone who shares it, everyone who listens, everyone who supports financially through Patreon, everyone who makes dua for it. If you do like this podcast and you want to support, please rate and share, or rate and comment on iTunes. That helps it go up in the charts. Share it with your people, anyone you think might be interested, and make dua for it. And then finally, if you have some dollars to give to it, to help support the production of the podcast, you can give to our Patreon site, patreon.com/pathandpresent, patreon.com/pathandpresent. And you can find the links in our iTunes as well as our SoundCloud. And Patreon allows you to support content creators, and we have one for this podcast. You can give as little as $1 a month, $5 a month, and that helps us cover our costs and helps us bring these wonderful voices to amplify them to the world, alhamdulillah. So thank you for listening, and we want to wish you a wonderful day and send you love and light. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. The medium of a podcast, I've been surprised at how dope it is, because at the same time, like what you mentioned before, which is like people have a shortened attention span and people, you know, aren't even going to sit through like a YouTube lecture or whatever. There's a truth to that, but there's also, if you really like look at some of the metrics on the successful podcasts that have like millions of downloads, they're people having 2-3 hour long conversations. And so it does show that, like, you know, I think there is something to that, inshallah. But, yeah, alhamdulillah. So I want to hear about your work. And the only book of yours that I've actually seen and kind of have some familiarity with is your first book, which is about Quran schooling in West Africa. But I know you also have a new work called Jihad of the Pen. And so it seems like your interest is in African history, but particularly Islamic history in Africa, in West Africa. But also that there's a interesting, like, you're also history of African American history, historian of African American history. So there's like that transatlantic piece. Yeah. And I know you've spent time also in West Africa and Senegal, particularly. So I think, what would you say is like at the actual heart of what you are most interested in as a historian? Because I know historians, even though it is a career, we pursue the questions that are deepest in our hearts, and that might take different, you know, directions. But what is that core question that you're seeking to answer through your research?
I mean, it's a difficult question to answer, because the answers changed over the course of time. But like, as you were asking it, I was like flashing back to like where it started for me, like what I was really most interested in getting to. And I think that in the end, like, I really first got interested in African history in order to try to figure out what Black people were before this happened to us. The way it happened, truthfully, is that I was playing minor league baseball, and I was on a 16-hour bus ride from Minneapolis to Saskatchewan. And it was a brother that I knew from my days at GW, at George Washington University in DC, who had recommended this book to me by Naeem Akbar. It's called Visions for Black Men. And it had a like vignette about the Honorable Elijah Muhammad, about Paul Robeson, about a third person. And the fourth person that was mentioned in this book was a person called Sheikh Anta Diop. That's what and I knew all the other people in the book, but I didn't know who this Sheikh Anta Diop person was. So I was getting ready for this 16-hour bus ride to Saskatchewan. So I went to the library. I'm like, I need some read materials for this long trip. And I checked out African Origin of Civilization, Myth or Reality by Sheikh Anta Diop from the Minneapolis Public Library. And I still have that book in my office right now at UC Santa Barbara. Because on that 16-hour bus ride, like, I read like all of this incredible stuff, you know, about African history. And my reaction was honestly like, wow, there's an African history now? Like, because I didn't know anything about it. I had never been taught anything significant about Africa. Like, through hip hop music and other places, like, I was always getting pointed back to the motherland, but I didn't have any content behind it. And all of a sudden, like, there was this, you know, African intellectual that was making this incredibly powerful argument that, like, the birthplace of civilization is ancient Egypt, and the ancient Egyptians were Black, and here's how they influence African civilization. Here's how they influence European civilization. And I was like, I need to know more about this. And so I looked up, and it was wild. It's like really one of those moments where like you can really pinpoint a single moment where your life changes. So I was playing minor league baseball. I'm 19 or 20 years old. And I'm hunched over this book. just on fire, like with this knowledge. And I look up, and Juan Berenguer, who had been previously a major league pitcher for the Detroit Tigers, Minnesota Twins, San Diego Padres, he was like 40 at the time, trying to make a big league comeback in his independent team. He's got bottles of tequila at the back of the bus, and they're passing bottles of tequila and a keg of beer up and down the aisles. And they're passing girly magazines, because this is before you could get pornography on your telephone. And so they're passing girly magazines, beer kegs, and tequila bottles up and down the aisles, wilding out. And here I am, hunched over African Origin of Civilization, Myth or Reality, like thinking, man, I need to know more about this. And I literally just had that thought, like, oh, I'm not where I'm supposed to be. Like, I'm in the wrong place. Like, it had been a summer of, watching these guys go from town to town, drinking and womanizing, and realizing that, like, I love baseball, I'm good at it, but maybe I'm never going to be comfortable on these buses for the rest of my life. And then when I got opened up to African history, I was like, this is, extraordinary. Why has all of this been hidden from me? I need to know more about this. So I just decided at that time I was going to go back to school and start to study. And within a year, I was in Senegal, on a study abroad, thing for 6 months. And like, that was the beginning of it changing my life. Like, and if you look at like all of my scholarly and intellectual output, from that time, in some way or another, it connects back to that moment, because it's about connecting African history with the African American experience. There was an important Islamic component in what Sheikh Anta Diop was talking about. And, more than anything, like, it was about like contesting white supremacy through like seeking genuine historical knowledge.
Yes. Yeah. MashaAllah. Yeah, that kind of thing, it actually reminds me of a moment that I remember in Seattle. Two of my best friends growing up, black brothers, and we were in the used bookstore, and I remember, and like, one of them said, "There's no books on Africa here. Like, what is this?" And I remember that like this old man came around the corner, almost like straight like a vision, like he came out of the vision realm, and he said, "Here." And he handed, They Came Before Columbus.
Ivan Van Sertima.
Yep.
Yeah, that was what I went to right after African Origin of Civilization. Yeah,
I read that, and I was like 17, and I was like, we were talking about last night, I was imbibing all this like Afrocentric messaging through hip hop, and then through the like circles I was in. And it's really profound how, and I was just thinking about this, because, you think about not only the Islamic movements in the 20th century, the Nation of Islam, Moorish Science Temple, 5%ers, etc. But also, you could take like the Rastafari religion. Yeah. You could take the Black Hebrew Israelites.
Absolutely.
They're all kind of like branches of like a kind of Garveyite, and this whole vision of like, okay, we have to reclaim who we always were. Yeah. Right?
Yeah.
And I have my own, it's interesting, like we were talking last night off mic, but like I think a lot of like white people that grew up in hip hop and were like also like kind of by default like molded in a very Afrocentric thing had a real interesting like, how do I square all this? And Islam became a place where a lot of these people could actually find like a reconciliation with whiteness. Yeah. But that's kind of a...
Well, I mean, the way that I looked at it, because so at that point in time, I had already become Muslim. Mm-hmm. So I came into Islam when I was 15. I had this experience probably when I was about 20. Mm-hmm. But really, like, the promise of like that kind of Islamic universalism had already become a disappointment for me. Right. By the time I was 20 years old, because I had a similar experience, like, the Afrocentric tip, like drew me into to a bunch of stuff. I started reading, got to the autobiography of Malcolm X. That's what ultimately brought me into Islam, read about the nation, all of that other stuff, became a Muslim, expecting like this kind of, universalist, liberatory community. And instead, like, I found the actual American Muslim community, which was hella racist. And so by the time I was, 19 or 20, like I had already, kind of become disillusioned really with a lot of what the American Muslim community was offering. So that was also another part of like my personal experience with it, is that like I felt like what was really calling me to Senegal specifically was really Africa. And it was only after I got to Africa that Islamic dimension really started to come back to life, because I started to see people who were living Islam like right, as opposed to the people that I had experienced here. But I think that what you say is true, that like that, especially, you know, like, because I did see this with a lot of the, you know, the white Muslim converts that came up around, you know, black people, is that like, you know, like Islam like gave a vehicle for making sense of like a certain kind of critique of, you know, what this place America is and the role of white supremacy in it, you know, that like allowed you to like, you know, like you didn't have to be the devil, like, you know, as according to the to the nation, you know, if you renounce devilry.
Yeah. And like reading the autobiography of Malcolm, you know what I mean? It's like, okay, and then he at the end he's like, you know, Islam can heal this.
It can heal this. Yeah, no, that's it. That's real.
And that's deep. But I want to get into your time in West Africa. Sure. And you know, you're speaking about coming up here and you know, reconnecting with your ancestral heritage outside of, like you mentioned the other night, the W.E.B. Du Bois, like measuring yourself with someone else's tape, right?
Man's tape, yeah.
So like being able to be in your ancestral homeland. So I'd just love to hear like what that was, how that was.
Man, it was a transformative experience. I mean, you know, it was 1996, and you know, like we just are getting an internet here. You know, like there is no internet, you know, there. You know, at the time, like it was a different world, you know, and I guess I'm dating myself by mentioning how long ago that was, but, so I get there and, I mean, I'll say something, you know, like on air that like really only like people that know me actually know, you know, which is that like I fly halfway, you know, around the world. I only had enough money from the scholarship that I got to go study, you know, to spend about 5 or 6 months there. So I had to buy, you know, the return ticket, which was 6 months out. The first night that I landed, I just was like, oh my God, I made a terrible mistake. I got to stay here for 5 or 6 months because I was tired from 20 hours of flying through Europe. And I get to, you know, halfway around the world and I'm like, where am I? You know, like I'm so far from everything that I've ever known, you know, like, and like that night I was just like, man, what have I done? You know, and then the dawn came, you know, and I was staying at a guest house at the University of Dakar campus and the sun is rising and I realized that like I'm 100 yards from the Atlantic Ocean, in like the most beautiful environment that I had ever seen. And I was like, oh man, you know, like, okay, no, this wasn't, you know, like a mistake, like I'm in the right place. And then, I mean, I just had this really incredible experience of like trying to process what America had done to me as an individual and to us as a people, that our behavior as Black people was so similar, but also so radically different from what I experienced in Senegal. Like I saw people that literally looked like relatives of mine. I saw people whose hand gestures and bodily movements like reminded me of people I grew up with, as though I had known them my whole life. But then again, at the same time, like I encountered the most civilized people that I had ever encountered. And I remember the first close friend that I made there, he's still a very close friend of mine. His name's Babakar Fall. And after probably about 2 weeks there, and, you know, had been getting to know this brother, he was the night watchman at the place that I stayed. So we used to just hang out and chain smoke cigarettes and drink Senegalese tea, you know, every night. And I said to him something, I was like, you know, because I was also seeing like what looked to me like really crushing poverty. And I had been extremely poor as a child, but I thought that like this was the worst poverty I ever seen. And I was reflecting on like how violent the DC that I had grown up in was. Like at the time, DC was still the murder capital of the U.S. There were 500 or 600 murders a year in a city of 600,000 or 700,000 people. And So I asked Babacar, I was like, well, how many murders a year are there, in Senegal? Like this poverty, like is real. Like, like, so I'm just like, was worried about like, the scale of crime and stuff like that. And he said, I'll never forget what he said. He said, murders? And I'm like, yeah. He said, you mean when somebody kills somebody on purpose? And I'm like, yeah. And he's like, 9 or 10. I said, what's the population of the country? At that time, it was like 6 million or something like that. I was like, y'all have 9 or 10 murders a year in a country that has a population of 6 million people. Whereas in, the city that I grew up in, we have 600 murders a year in a city that has 600,000 or 700,000 people. And like by every objective measure, the poverty here is, worse than it is, when I grew up. And I grew up being like evicted from every place that I ever lived at until I was like 8 years old. I never spent a calendar year at the same address until I was 8 years old. And what I told him then, like, and this was really like, kind of like the beginning of like really trying to understand like how African culture and Islam was fundamentally humanizing. What I said to him then, I said, look, if you left my people under these material circumstances, leave for 6 months, come back, we'd have killed each other off. And that's when like I realized that like, something, something precious, had been like, taken from us or so radically endangered that like it needed to be resuscitated. And in order to be resuscitated, it needed to be understood, so that was when I like started to really, try to kind of, get into a deeper exploration of what made these people so much more civilized, than what I was used to. Yeah.
And for those that haven't visited, cause I've had the blessing of visiting West Africa a couple times and traveling throughout Senegal and the Gambia. But maybe you could paint a picture of what the expression of Islam is like there, because it's so beautiful and it's so wonderful. And I mean, you just see that, Sheikh Ahmadou Bamba and Sheikh Ibrahim Niass's face are everywhere. And yeah, so maybe you could just speak about the expression of Islam you found there.
Yeah, I mean, so that was the first thing is that like the Islam that I had come into in the late 80s in America was very preachy and self-conscious, like it was, now as an academic, I would like classify it as like affected and performative, and if my grandma had to describe it, she would have probably described it as people putting on airs, like it was really a kind of like external performance of piety. What you see in Senegal is something so dramatically different, from that. You see an Islam where like it's not about telling people about creed or, trying to convince people that, the mistake that they've made makes them a bad person or any of that stuff. It's just Islam is expressed by like being decent, kind, generous, and open-hearted. That's Islam. Islam is being a human being towards other human beings. And like first respecting and acknowledging one another's humanity before anything else happens. And I'll give you a very small example and then I'll answer like the question that you actually asked. But a very small example was like maybe the second week I was in Dakar, I was downtown I was trying to get somewhere, by a particular time. I didn't have a watch on, didn't have a cell phone, back in those days to just check the time. So I asked this brother that was, standing on the corner, what time it was. And he just looked at me. And at first I thought maybe I was mispronouncing, what I was saying. So I asked him again. And I was like, do you have the time? And he just, kind of looked at me. And I'm like, I'm sorry, am I not saying, this right? And he said, no. He said, you asked the question, fine. He said, but here we greet people before we ask them questions. And I was like, my bad, salam alaikum. And he said, alaikum salam. It's 2:30. And like and it was just a small thing, but I realized like what he was saying is like, treat me like a person rather than as a means to an end.
Yeah.
You know, like acknowledge my humanity first, and then whatever whatever you need. But I also saw like, people who like were in objective terms like poor, but whose greatest pleasure was in like lavishing hospitality on people. Just given with incredible kindness. And then, like you said, also, like everywhere you went, you saw, like public expression of people's commitment to their spiritual guides. Ahmadou Bamba, Abdul Qadir Jilani, Ahmed Tijan Sharif, Sheikh Ibrahim Yas, Elhaj Malik Si. You be in the middle of the hood and have full-length wall murals to Abdul Qadir Jilani. Like there's one right across the street from my best friend's, like apartment right smack dab in the middle of the hood, full-length wall mural of Abdul Qadir Jilani right in the middle of the hood. Like the way that, you got a Biggie, a mural in the middle of Brooklyn, like you got, the Awliya Allah, framing every corner of people's existence. So like you have this constant reminder of like righteous people. So it's just a very, very different place. It's a very different place. So put it like just a little data behind it. And this is something that I cite in Jihad of the Pen, is that like Pew Research did polling in different parts of the Muslim world for the number of people that self-identify with the Sufi order in different Muslim countries. And the top 11 countries are all in West Africa.
Mm-hmm. As far as percentage?
As far as percentage that self-identify with the Sufi movement. And the Senegal is the highest.
It's like 98.
92% of people self-identify with the Sufi movement. The next highest is, I believe, Chad at 55%.
Wow. Yeah.
And throughout West Africa, the numbers hover around 30% in most places. Now, mind you, outside of West Africa, there is no other country in the world where that number reaches 30%.
Subhanallah. Subhanallah.
So it's this place where, like, Sufi principles, Sufi etiquette, reverence for the beloveds of God is like just part of the culture.
Yeah, that's beautiful when you put it like that. It's like if there is one Sufi country on earth, it's Senegal, basically.
Senegal is the Sufiest place on earth. Yeah. That's the.
And you feel that when I was there. It's just real love of Allah, love of the Prophet, and love of the saintly people.
That's it.
And that's like everyone just imbued, no matter who you are.
No matter who you are.
Like shopkeeper, businessman, old lady cooking, like dude who's kind of like running the street and kind of like caught up, but he's still like wearing the necklace of his wali around his neck, and
he's still down for Ahmadou Bamba, or it's down for Sheikh Ibrahim, no doubt.
Yeah.
No doubt. And that, like, that's all the way, that's all the way real. I've told this story, like a few times, but that was like kind of part of my re-education was buying a pair of bootleg Air Jordans from a sneaker vendor in downtown Dakar, maybe like in my first month in town. And he had an Ahmadou Bamba picture on a necklace around his neck. And I was, all on the whole, kind of like Salafi trip, basically, like, well, that's shirk. Why you got a picture of this dude around your neck? Like all believers should have a one-to-one relationship with God, and that whole thing. And, it was, and this is also like part of the broader lesson, like, is you never know who you're talking to in Senegal. Like I was talking to a, 19 or 20-year-old, and he proceeded to like, school me. So he was like, well, I hear that kind of thing a lot, like from Westerners, I guess even especially Americans, is probably that whole all men are created equal thing. He said, which is a great thing to say, but we all know it isn't true. And he was like, take these Jordans. No matter how hard you practice at basketball, you'll never be as good at basketball as Michael Jordan. And I was like, yeah, no, that's true. And then he was like, you're a student, right? And I'm like, yeah. And he's like, well, let's say you're studying physics. No matter how much you apply yourself to the study of physics, you'll never master physics the way that Einstein did. And I'm like, nah, for sure I won't. And he said, and that's because certain people are given more innate talent for athletics or for intellectual achievement than other people. He said, and the same thing is true of spirituality. So this person that you see around my neck, Ahmadou Bamba, he was like a Michael Jordan or an Albert Einstein in the realm of spirituality.
Mm-hmm.
And those of us that are trying to make progress in our religion, we're going to follow behind a master. We're going to follow behind an expert. That's why I stay behind this one.
Mashallah. So as far as your writings, you have the one about Quranic schooling,
Mm-hmm. The Walking Quran.
the Walking Quran, and then you have Jihad of the Pen. Do you have another one between those, or those are the
So
two?
those are the two books, and then there's also like other publications, and a lot of my stuff on Muslim anti-slavery movements have been published in article form because I'm working on a book right now that's specifically about that.
Okay.
And so most of that stuff has appeared in articles so far, not
So
in
maybe
book
we
form.
could talk about those three topics.
Sure.
So first, the first book. Yeah, maybe you could just like introduce what you were trying to tackle, what you were trying to cover in that.
I mean, what I was trying to tackle was like, so I became convinced pretty early on that Quran schooling was something that was important in West Africa, but I didn't really know why. Because this was pre 9/11 and there weren't a lot of academics that, especially people that are working on Africa, that were really explicitly interested in Islam.
Mm-hmm.
I had people tell me when told them that I was interested in studying Quran schooling in Senegal, I had academics tell me, why would you do a history of Bible school? Like, what could you possibly learn? Like, the idea was that they were intellectually uninteresting, and therefore, like, you shouldn't necessarily pay attention to them. Fortunately, my PhD advisor wasn't one of those people. He was somebody who like was intrinsically interested in the question and thought it was an interesting question. And then when I went back to Senegal as a graduate student to kind of like do a feasibility study, every Senegalese person that I talked to about potentially doing this as my topic was like, you have to do that. Nothing is more misunderstood outside of West Africa than this, because Quran schooling is something that was and still is getting like lambasted in the press. People talk about it in terms of exploitation of children, there's all these terrible stereotypes about Quran schooling that didn't reflect in any way people's internal understandings of what Quran schooling did and how it worked. I think that like in part I was just trying to understand like why Quran schooling was so important in West African society and so poorly understood outside. And that in the end led me to like reflect on epistemology, on the nature of knowledge itself. Is that the reason why like practices in Quran schools looked so strange to people on the outside was that the people who were teaching Quran schools, the parents who were sending their children there, even young men and women who grew up in them were carrying such a radically different conception of what knowledge was that it didn't even look like knowing to Westerners and other people that were on the outside, and vice versa. Like the people within Quran schools had really sharp critiques over the inadequacies of Western forms of education. And those sharp critiques had never actually been heard in any of the academic literature, because nobody was asking like what people formed in traditional institutions of Islamic knowledge actually had to say, like what their critique of Western knowledge transmission might look like. So I knew that like I was onto something significant when I started to like think about knowledge and knowledge transmission from the standpoint of traditional Quran schooling and use that as a way to critique Western post-Enlightenment forms of secular rationalism. Like I knew that like as time unfolded and I really got into the materials and interviewed, I had like 80 or 100 hours of interviews with people who grew up in Quran schools, in addition to like a lot of documentary stuff. Like I was starting to form a picture of just a radically different conception of what it is to know. And then I knew that if I could get inside that conception of what it is to know, I could say something powerful, not just about West African Muslims, not just about West African Muslim society, but about Islam itself, and more importantly, about what was deficient in this fake rationalism that has become a religion of its own in the West.
So the Walking Quran, which is a beautiful title, taken from the wife of the Prophet ﷺ's description of him, when Aisha said he was the walking Quran, or he was the Quran walking, describing his character, sallallahu alaihi wasallam. So I'd love to hear, like, what does it mean to be a walking Quran? And how do I become one?
I mean, and that's really the challenge, because it's easy to teach people new content with respect to knowledge, but it's very difficult to teach people a new way to know in the first place. You have to unlearn the way that you learn, and then be retrained, re-socialized.
Not what do you know, but how
do you know it? And that's something that the Muslims need to reflect on, because we very often like approach problems in Islam from either a political level, like it's about a struggle over resources, or an ideological level, it's about a struggle over ideas. But we very rarely analyze things as at an epistemological level, that there's some kind of fundamental incommensurability between two understandings of what it means to know in the first place. Right. So we change the content thinking that it's going to change the outcome, but if you haven't challenged the bedrock of knowledge upon which it's based, then you just reproduce the same result but with different content. Having said that, how do you do it? You kind of actually have to unlearn everything that the West teaches you about what a human being is. You have to, like Cartesian and even Aristotelian rationalism posit the existence of a thing called a mind that is in a position of dominance and control over a body, and that if you intervene at the level of a mind, then you can command the limbs to do certain things. So the target of its activity is always the mind, always the mind, always the mind. But like we were talking about at Wednesday night's event, the mind itself as a noun is a thing that doesn't occur in the Quran at all. Aql never appears as a noun in the Quran. Intellection, aqla, understanding, appears in the Quran, but the target of that, or the site of that intellection and reflection, is always the heart. So you have to start with like a different understanding of what a human being is, and actually get retrained on how you begin to root like your knowing, your perception, your understanding in your heart, and having that express itself on the limbs. And that's something that just comes actually with like sitting with people of knowledge and being reshaped in your comportment just by being around people who assimilate the world differently than what you're used to. It's something that is acquired through mimesis, basically just like imitation and nearness. It's something that is acquired through like listening to intonations, patterns of sentiment, patterns of feeling, affective, behavior. Like it starts to change the way that you process information. And there's a very easy way to kind of like understand how that process works, which is like, so my mother, fled from my father when I was 7 years old to save her life because she was being abused. She kidnapped me from his house and took us, me and my brother, into hiding, and then moved many states away for safety. And yet anybody that knew my father will tell you that my hand gestures, my mannerisms, my speech patterns, all are just like him. And it was just because I spent every day at that man's locksmith shop until I was 7 years old, so that through a pattern of unconscious mimesis, assimilation of the way that he carried himself, the things that he did with his hands, I became a reproduction of him at some level. And that anybody that was ever around him can see that. And that's how mimesis functions in a master-disciple relationship as well. Yes. Is that just by being around a sheikh or a sheikha, you start to take on elements of how they carry themselves. And as you take on elements of how they carry themselves, those things that are expressing themselves externally on your limbs start to work their way into your heart until they just become a part of your character without it requiring requiring any conscious reflection, without it requiring a self-conscious performance. It just becomes part of how you're hardwired. That is a subtle process that analytical reason and discursive transmission of knowledge cannot capture. Suhba is what they used to call it. Just keeping company with someone. That's the most important, kind of form of education. So I guess I hate to say it, like there is no shortcut to it except like sitting with the people of knowledge and like having your own character and comportment reconfigured just by proximity to them. And then, learning to assimilate knowing as it, comes to you from the world in ways that are similar to the way that they do it. And it'll never be exactly, no one's ever a replica of somebody else. It's just that you internalize certain comportments in your own way. And then you re-express those, and then others grab onto that. And then they take a piece, and then they bring that piece to life within themselves. I don't know if that makes any sense.
No, there's a lot in there, actually.
Okay, go ahead.
Which angle to go, because I feel like there's so much there. The initial thing that this sparks for me is because there's a few, I think, misunderstandings from people that might come from a more Western analytical background and look at this traditional way of learning and knowing and being. And one, because you often hear saying, oh, these Quran schools just rote memorization. Or you see, and even Muslims, you hear a lot, like people say, modern Muslims saying like, oh, well, this, following the sunnah, it's like, we don't need to know how the prophet got on and off of his horse or whatever. And it's like, you know what I mean? And it's like, it hurts to actually, I can see it in your face, because someone who understands what following the sunnah is, it's like, and I've been reflecting on this, that like, in other words, I think modern Western people, like in academia, it's like the whole thing is you have to establish yourself by critiquing what came before. The idea of like following someone so closely that you become, and part of it is like this, I think this is a way to like reframe it that's useful, but that really like gets at the kind of like Sufi perspective of things, is that you follow the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam because he is more you than you are. He is more you than you are. In other words, he is the insan al-kamil. He is the perfected human being. Yeah. And while we're all unique, and just as we have something as seemingly insignificant as our fingertips are completely unique, even identical twins. What about our heart? What about our ruh, our spirit? However, as we were talking about last night, it's like in the Quran, darkness is always plural and light is always one.
Yeah, it's always singular. Yeah.
And so the Prophet ﷺ is light.
Yeah, for sure.
And so
Nurun ala nur.
He has, you could say, realized the essence of what is deepest inside us is that Muhammadan light. Yeah. And so the more we follow him, the more we become our true self, actually. And the Shaykh is the one who has already traversed that path and can be our living example of the prophetic. Yes.
So there's several things to say. I very much like what you said. The way that I would texture the first part of it was that it's not just that you become a realization of him, sallallahu alaihi wasallam, but it's actually that you become the fuller measure of you. So like Omar, for example, may Allah be well pleased with him, doesn't stop being Omar. No. He still is rough around the edges. He's still, the right hand. He's still the sword. But he's a perfected version of himself. Like all of those traits that he brought. And the way that I often talk about this is that God smooths some surfaces and he leaves others jagged so that you'll fit where he's putting you. And also because some things need a serrated edge to cut them, some situations need an Omar. Everybody can't be an Abu Bakr. Everybody can't be smooth and melody. So we're all different, but we all find the most perfected version of ourselves in putting ourselves on the footsteps of the messengers, peace be upon them all, and especially on the footstep of the most perfected amongst them, sallallahu alaihi wasallam. And the reason is, as you say, we become the truest version of ourselves. There's a formula of sending blessings that was given as a gift in a waking state to Ahmed Tijan Sharif, may Allah be well pleased with him, complete his works. It's called Jawaratul Kamal, which is often translated as the pearl of perfection, but the best way of translating is probably the flawless gem. Okay, and it's a formula for sending blessings on the Prophet ﷺ that comes at the end of the Tijani wazifa. And when I would sit with the Tijanis, over extended periods of time, made ziyarah to Ahmed Tijani in Morocco, spent a lot of time with the community, I was blessed with what I felt like was an understanding of what the real significance of that flawless gem was, which is that there's only ever been one perfect mirror for the divine light, sallallahu alaihi wasallam. There's only ever been one unblemished heart. That flawless gem, what is the function of a gem is that it refracts all of the light that hits it.
Facets.
So, exactly, those facets. So when that divine light is cast onto the heart of the messenger of God, sallallahu alaihi wasallam, it expresses itself in an infinite number of variegated beams of different colors, intensities, frequencies, and wavelengths. And each one of those is us. We are all an expression of that light that is individual and special and unique and functions according to its own individuality, and yet we are all both from that same originating divine source, and we are all refracted through that same flawless gem. I hope that good part of the tape wasn't ruined by my phone vibrating in the background.
MashaAllah. No, it's beautiful. And it's so amazing, I think, to like be and they're exceedingly rare, you could say, but in an environment of traditional Islamic learning, in a sense, because everyone is swimming in the Quran, you could say.
Yes.
So every conversation, every lesson, you just make a reference, and it unlocks a universe of symbolism.
Yes.
Right? You just have to mention Moses throwing down his staff, or you just have to mention Joseph in the well, and it unlocks the symbolic universe. And like, for instance, Maulana Rumi, so beloved in our country, someone did a study and they said a quarter of his lines of poetry are explicitly commenting on a Quranic verse. Of course, yeah. And of course, the other 3/4 are implicitly, but you see that it's all this. It exists with it's a whole universe. It's a whole civilization of meaning that you're able to access, and it's inexhaustible at the same time. And to be in a place where everyone has that kind of touchstone or that same reference point, they're swimming in the same ocean, is so refreshing.
And that's a huge part of and it's something that's very poorly understood, is that the bedrock of that spirituality in West Africa is not Sufism as such. It is the fact that Sufi traditions have preserved that intense focus on the Quran. The Quran as an existential reality, the Quran as the source of all meaning and all knowledge, the Quran as not just a book to be recited, but one to be meditated upon, one to be used in litanies, one to be used for spiritual unveiling, one to be used for active reflection, all of those things, this well-rounded approach to the Quran. And that's the reason why in those places people are constantly coming back to the Quran, being nourished by the Quran, spending 40 days just reciting a certain number of times a single ayah of the Quran until the realities of that ayah present themselves to the heart instead of simply coming as a matter of reflection. So that and and this is something that's really of profound importance, because the Prophet ﷺ told us that in the end of days, the people, there's going to be lots of people reciting the Quran, but it won't get past their throat. Like, it will not reach their hearts. They'll be saying words, but it won't be penetrating down to the heart. By focusing on Quran schooling in this particular way, like, you assure that people have the appropriate posture of humility in front of the word, you create the ideal circumstances for them to absorb the Quran at the level of the heart, and then everything after that is going to pass through that filter. It's going to come through the Quran and through a sound and healthy approach to the Quran, so people will stay like attached to the Quran. And we are so far from that, like in this country, people are they're a long way from the Quran. The Quran is distant, from them. Yes. And also when we approach the Quran, we are also using like a very Western imperialist conception of knowledge. Like, we are always trying to conquer the Quran. I'm going to memorize more of the Quran. I'm going to understand the Quran. I'm going to go out and get the Quran. Listen, you can't take anything from God. He gives of his knowledge as he wills. The approach in West Africa is to just prepare the receptacle and allow people to be conquered by the Quran, instead of producing like people who are trying to conquer the Quran.
And that really gets down to like that jewel is at the center of your being. One of my teachers once said, he said, God is at the center of everyone's being. He said, but why can't we say I am God? He said, because you're not at the center of your being. The whole path is about chipping away the layers to get there, and that's
the one who knows himself knows his
how
Lord.
You know versus what you know is like, and also the other thing is like to living exemplars, like, and that you're talking about a society where you mentioned the superheroes, right? Or the people that people look up to. It's not, right? They're not putting Biggie or whoever famous person on the mural on the wall. It's the great saints, the great awliya and the salihin. And so when you see someone who really is a walking Quran, it takes it from an intellectual thing to like, that's what it is. And there's a heart relationship. Like, you feel this person has a quality that, like you said, is unself-conscious, and they're completely... Harun Sujik, who wrote, who's one of our elders in our community and an author, he said something beautiful. He said, I met a lot of saints in my time. I was blessed,
Alhamdulillah.
And he said, one thing I noticed about them is they all have this quality that they don't have any skin in the game.
That's real.
And that was such a profound way. Like, in other words, there's no individual I that wants anything in these people.
Well, so there's multiple levels to address that, but I'll just address it from the level of spiritual realities first. Is that when you become a spiritually realized person, your mission and the nature of your specific mission is fully accounted to you, with all of its conditions and all of its limitations. So it obviates any need for ambition. you have a specific task that you are tasked with in order to fulfill the word that is written upon you, and everything else that you do other than that is a distraction, and only that which you do to accomplish that secures that which God has already given to you. So it makes the criteria for orienting your action very clear. And that's why the awliya don't have a lot of wasted motion in their plan, because it has been revealed to them through inspiration the precise nature of their own mandate. And so therefore there's not going to be a lot of wasted motion in the plan. They're not going to have any skin in the game, because it's not a matter of personal fulfillment. It's not a matter of performative piety. It's a matter of you already have been shown the word that is written for you. You simply have to fulfill it. I don't know if that makes sense.
Yeah.
So that's part of the reality, that those people are dealing with. So then in a society that is organized and oriented towards pointing people towards those kinds of individuals, then they're very well positioned to guide others to a realization of their own individual missions. Because they don't have personal aspirations, they're not there to take anything from them. They're simply there to help guide other people to the closest approximation of what they themselves have been given. That applies to that person. And there's also something that's really, really powerful in the fact that it has to be these human exemplars. This is not something that can be reproduced through an isolated engagement with texts. It has to be produced through a heart-to-heart, even knee-to-knee relationship with human beings, and it's part of God's generosity that He uses people to guide other people. That's His established sunnah. That's why He sends prophets. Peace be upon them all. Is because in so doing, He multiplies the blessing for both the guide and the guided. The guide benefits and the guided benefit, and that's part of His generosity towards Bani Adama. That's part of His generosity towards the human race, is that He allows us to be the vehicles through which we draw closer to Him.
Yeah, and it reminds me too of and this gets back to that question about what you know versus how you know. And you know through a knower. Right? You know through an arif billah. What the knower is billah. Yeah. That they know by Allah. How do they know?
They know through Allah.
Through Allah,
exactly.
by Allah.
Yeah,
with Allah.
Yep.
So that's also interesting, that term. Arif billah is also, it's not that they know Allah, which is you could say a what, but it's billah, which is a how. Yeah. It's how they know, which is profound.
Yeah.
Subhanallah. And I was just thinking of the Ihya of Imam Ghazali, and it's 40 books, and as you know, he's trying to write a book that will cover the entire deen, right? Yes. So there's the outward, the inward. It's 4 quarters. First quarter is like ibadah or acts of worship. Second quarter is about mu'amalat, of worldly interactions. Then the third quarter is about the virtues, the vices, and the last quarter about the virtues. So it's like outward and inward, but it's 40 books, and the 20th book is the book on the character of the messenger of God. The
middlemost and innermost,
which is it's literally like the axis. So, and it's, you know what I mean?
I do.
It's profound. His architecture in that is just we need the human exemplar, and
we do.
You can't hold any of this without it.
Yeah. There's before we get into the human exemplar and the character of the human exemplar, I do have a different understanding of Ihya Ulumuddin, I think, than most people, and I'll just share that since it's cited here. For me, Ihya Ulumuddin is written to make better Muslims, but that's not its primary reason for me. The primary reason is for the production of better scholars.
Yeah. Because
what Ghazali knows through personal experience, that you can gain more in terms of becoming a human being by cleaning the latrines with your beard than you can with studying the religious sciences. Yeah. He calls it the revival of the religious sciences, not the revival of the deen.
No.
And the reason is that he wants to pair the genuine jihad and nafs with the struggle to understand the exoteric sciences. Yes. And the reason is that as long as your heart is burdened with diseases, as long as your intellect is occupied with obeying the decrees that come from the nafs, then you are intellectually stunted. It's impossible to achieve your full intellectual productivity and insight when your nafs is enslaving your spirit and your heart. So he's trying to pair the struggle for the liberation of the spirit with the analytical sciences in order to bring back together something that had become separate. The analytical sciences and the spiritual path had grown apart as different disciplines.
Yes.
And they had once been a single form of knowing that was embodied in the person of the messenger himself.
Yes.
All Ghazali is trying to do is to bring back actual knowledge
Yes. Yes.
amongst the people who call themselves scholars, by freeing them from the burdens of the chattering of the nafs so that they can become the scholars that they want to be. And I'll tell you how this was explained to me in Senegal. Is I had organized a conference about different forms of Islamic education. There was a black Mauritanian Fulani scholar who came, and because he didn't speak Wolof like as fluently as the other people, he spoke relatively little during the conference. But on the second day, he asked for the microphone, and he said, "I've heard a lot about new forms of Islamic education and different approaches to teaching Quran and the sciences." And he said, "But I still teach the old-fashioned way. When a student comes, I dip their finger in the ink, and I trace with their finger on the board, ba, and I say ba into the ear, and they repeat it with the tongue, and they see it with the eye, and they touch it with the hand." He was saying that all of the senses become engaged. He's still doing it this old way. He said, and then we proceed, through the different sciences over the course of the life of that child as they become mature. And he said, and as I reflect on the different approaches, I reflect on the outcomes. He said, as soon as I find someone who is produced in the new schools that writes as much and as well as Imam Ghazali, Sheikh Ahmed Ubamba, and Sheikh Ibrahim Yas, I will switch the way that I teach. But until then, I'm going to stick with the way of training people that produced Imam Ghazali, Ahmed Ubamba, and Sheikh Ibrahim Yas.
And I'm glad you said that because, and in fact, that reading of Ghazali is absolutely correct. And he essentially says as much in the first book, Kitab al-Ilm. And he says like ilm, and he talks about fiqh. He says fiqh, that we call fiqh, this, and he like kind of like, it actually shocked me when I first read it, because he's like, what, like this like rules of menstruation and things like that people talk about. He said that's not what the Prophet ﷺ meant. The fuqaha are those that have a deep knowledge of
understanding.
God.
That's it. Yeah.
And then he also says like fiqh itself, he's like there's sciences, the worldly sciences and sciences of the akhirah.
Yeah.
And he puts fiqh in the worldly sciences.
For sure it is.
Which is profound, because
sure
he says like you could, and he said the proof is you can study that and not be on the path to the afterlife. Like it's just, you know what I mean? It's, and so
real talk.
And you're right. And it's really interesting too, because his brother Ahmed Ghazali was really the one who stayed on him when he went down that scholarly path and was like, you're really down a treacherous path.
Yeah, be careful.
Sitting with all these kings and with all these, and what's interesting is Ahmed Ghazali wrote mostly in Persian, and so he's more famous in the Persian world.
Yep.
And the Persians, the Persian Sunni tradition, they always said like Ahmed Ghazali far surpassed his brother Abu Hamid because he never dabbled in all of that. He just went straight to Allah. And but in any case, these are important things. So we should wrap up pretty soon. I see Maghrib's gonna come in shortly.
Okay, inshallah.
But we didn't get to talk about your other work.
We'll save it for another podcast if you want to, but I can say something about it.
Yeah, just say a few words about it, inshallah.
Jihad of the Pen is a work that I completed with 3 other scholars. 2 of them were my first 2 graduate students that I trained, Zakaria Wright and Amir Syed. And the third is Sheikh Muhammad Sharif, who contributed the translations of Uthman Danfodio's works, and who also co-wrote with me the introduction to the sections on Uthman Danfodio. So what Jihad of the Pen is it's in a single volume, it's 3 pieces of writing from what one could argue are the 4 most influential Sufi authors of the last 200 years. Uthman Danfodio, Elhaj Umar Tal, Ahmed Ubamba Mbake, and Sheikh Ibrahim Yas. two Tijani scholars, a Qadri and the founder of the Muridiyya, who were profoundly influential in the spread of Sufi thought. And we took a sample from each different stage in their lives, some of their early writings, middle writings, and later writings, poetry, prose, different pieces. And Zachary Wright writes the introduction to that volume, and I wrote the conclusion. And the conclusion I entitled The Prophet, the Quran, and Islamic Ethics. And it's my attempt to come to terms with the ultimate meaning of Sufism in West Africa, and to try to connect what is implicit in all of the pieces that are translated in the volume, which is the relationship between Sufism as the science of akhlaq, character training, and as Sufism as the science of haqa'iq. And it's about the relationship, therefore, between ethics and spirituality in Islam.
MashaAllah. And that's out.
It's out. Yeah,
Okay,
people, yeah, definitely check it out.
And
Inshallah.
then, you also mentioned you're working on a book about slave rebellions.
Yeah, it's anti-slavery movements in West Africa. It's called the First Atlantic Revolution: Islam, Abolition, and Republic before 1776. And it grows out of chapter 3 of the Walking Quran, which is called the Book in Chains, which is about how a number of different Muslim anti-slavery movements in West Africa were sparked by the visceral reaction to the enslavement of Walking Qurans, of beloved scholars. And I liken it in that work to the reaction that people in the Muslim world had when Terry Jones wanted to burn copies of the Quran, that like if this sparked a visceral response amongst the Muslims in the 21st century, what about the public abuse and enslavement of beloved exemplars of the Book of God in West Africa? And what I found was that that when these people were enslaved, it led to a number of anti-slavery movements, social rebellions, and social movements. And one of them leads to the creation of the first state in the modern world to abolish the institution of slavery, which is the Islamic Republic of Futa Toro in 1770. And so the book that I'm writing now not only details that anti-slavery movement and how it was understood and actually very widely known in Europe at its time. The founder of the London Society for the Abolition of the Slave Trade actually takes his inspiration in large part from an African Muslim anti-slavery movement that he researches. So it's about how that movement actually informs the growth of Western abolitionism, but also how enslaved African Muslims who struggled against slavery in the Senegal River Valley and in other parts of West Africa ultimately carried elements of that revolution into slave rebellions that became the Haitian Revolution, into slave rebellions in Antigua, into South Carolina, into Georgia, into Louisiana. It's an effort to track the way in which a certain kind of Islamic anti-slavery actually becomes an important part of Western societies. And just one kind of like small piece of that is that there's a significant chance that that the great-great-grandfather of Frederick Douglass is descended from one of these Senegambian revolutionaries, Muslim revolutionaries that is arrives in the Georgia Sea Islands probably in the 1780s. So that, and there are other places where you can track like a direct relationship between West African freedom struggles and Black American freedom struggles in this country. So again, we're now back where we started, right? Where I was sitting on that bus trying to reflect on how to connect my own experience as an African American to this hidden history that had been hidden from me about Africa. And for sure, that hidden history of Muslim anti-slavery struggles is something that has been intentionally kept from us as people, as Black people, as Muslims, as human beings, in order to preserve the fiction that European Enlightenment rationalism is the source of freedom in human history.
MashaAllah. Yeah, that's profound. And, I think that other point you mentioned related is that, like, you mentioned these walking Qur'ans. And you can't write that history unless you understand, like, internally how people venerate the awliya and the salihin.
That's it.
And I remember Sylviane Diouf in the Servants of Allah book, she talks about a specific rebellion, I think in Brazil, where they had imprisoned their sheikh. They had imprisoned their sheikh, and like they understood him to be a great saint, and so the whole thing is like, all right, we're gonna break him out of prison, and like whatever happens. And so I'm glad you're highlighting all these things are really important for all of us. And I've really felt in my time in West Africa, and having had the blessing of traveling many places in the Muslim world, that the place that Muslims in America most need to connect with, no matter what their background happens to be, to understand a healthy viability of an Islam that can root itself in these lands, is West Africa.
For sure.
And for many reasons. Obviously, the rooting of Islam in these lands through West Africans, but also there's something in the culture that, there's a connection.
Yeah. The one thing that I would say about that is that the thing that maybe we can draw the most benefit from in the West African Islamic tradition, and it's related to that anti-slavery piece that you just mentioned, but also to kind of the broader respect for the Awliya, is that what you see there is a cultivation of veneration and love for both truth and all of its embodied bearers.
And I mean, we can add to that, of course, it's a different podcast, but the way that men and women interact is so beautiful and honorable and like noble, and also fits with the West. Like the way that certain,
it's way healthier.
Other Muslim cultures, there's no way to transpose that here without doing severe damage. It's just, you know what I mean? Yeah. So that's another podcast.
We should probably do a whole separate podcast on like the healthy gender relations in Islam and West Africa. That would be a beneficial thing. Inshallah.
Allah bless you.
May Allah bless us both together. Inshallah.